Well, why don't we begin? Welcome everyone to this meeting of the Hoover Economic Policy Working Group. We're really happy to have Brian Wheaton speak to us today. It's a great topic with an ingenious way to analyze it. So minimum wages and the rigid wage channel of monetary policy. So Brian, take it away. I'm sure we have lots of questions. Is it okay if we interrupt as we go too? Okay.
Yes, feel free to do that.
Well, welcome, Brian.
Thanks, John. Yeah, like you said, I'll be presenting this paper called Minimum Wages and the Rigid Wage Channel of Monetary Policy. This is joint work with my co-author, Robbie Minton, who's a PhD student at Harvard. To give you an idea of what we'll be talking about today. So monetary policy, as we know, it acts on nominal rigidities. The minimum wage is an example of a legislatively fixed nominal object. Consequently, the real minimum wage is relaxed by inflation. Once inflation has occurred, workers can be hired at a cheaper, real minimum wage. And so, taking this into account, the question becomes, does monetary policy have a larger effect on employment in the presence of a higher share of minimum wage workers, when this legislatively fixed nominal object is more binding? And if so, how quantitatively important is this particular channel of monetary policy efficacy? Let me start with a bit of motivation for how we're thinking about this. So recall the profit maximization problem of a competitive firm. Firm is just going to maximize its production, subtracting off price of its production, subtracting off the input costs. And, if we denote with L, labor subject to the wage floor, minimum wage, and X, denoting all other inputs, then if we have some expansionary monetary policy that's increasing both the price level in the economy, P, and the cost of these other inputs, X, but is not affecting the nominal minimum wage, W bar, then what inflation, as a result of this expansionary monetary policy, is leading to is firstly a substitution effect toward low-skilled workers, minimum wage workers, as the real minimum wage has fallen while other input prices have remained constant. And secondly, a scale effect. So inflation has reduced one real input price, and therefore firms are being induced to use a bit more of all inputs. Let me give you more of a graphical intuition for this as well. Next slide, please. So inflation, of course, is causing prices and market wages, W, to increase, while the minimum wage, as I noted, remains fixed nominally. So the real minimum wage is going to decline. This is reducing the extent of the distortion in the labor market. So if we look at the graph on the top right there, we have our sort of starting position. We can think of this as before monetary policy, before an expansionary monetary policy shock has gone into effect. We have a amount of low-skilled labor that is below equilibrium due to the wage floor, due to the minimum wage. And when we basically have this expansionary shock, monetary policy, what that does is it increases prices, increases market wages, the minimum wage remains fixed, so W bar over P prime, the new price level, has declined. And as you can see in the bottom right panel, the extent of the distortion in the labor market has been reduced. We've gotten sort of closer to a market equilibrium. New hiring, particularly of minimum wage workers, has occurred as a result of this relaxation. So one thing you might be wondering as I'm going through this is how many workers are actually on the minimum wage? So what this plot shows is precisely that. Let me explain it since there are two series on here. So firstly, on the right vertical axis, we have the real federal minimum wage in 2017 dollars, and that's denoted with the straight bold line in the top of the graph. So we can see that it's at its highest levels in the late 1970s. It declines over the course of the 1980s when there aren't any increases to the federal minimum wage. Then we can see sort of bumps back up in the early 90s, the 91 increase in the minimum wage, 96, 97, and 2007 to 2009 increases. Now, the box plot on the bottom of the graph is showing basically the share of workers who are on the minimum wage over time. And there's heterogeneity across states, so that's what the box plot is showing. As you can see, at the start of this period, in the late 70s, early 80s, a minimum wage share of 15% or even 20% in a few cases is not extreme. There are some states which have over a 20% share of minimum wage workers in this era because the real minimum wage is quite high. That's generally decreasing over time, reaches its lowest levels before the federal minimum wage increases of the late 2000s.
Right, could I
Sure.
so those increases in the minimum wage, of course, are not exogenous. So you're going to get your monetary policy effect until inflation builds up to the point that they raise the minimum wage again.
Right. Right. So it's certainly the case that, those increases are not exogenous. As you'll see now that we're getting into the empirical section, we're going to basically hone in on a bunch of different sources of variation. And none of them will be perfect, but hopefully they will sort of, shore up each other's weaknesses. And you'll see that we're getting very much the same result, regardless of which source of variation we're using.
And there's lots of other sticky wages out there, like tenured professor salaries, government workers. Sticky wages is the heart of many standard models. I presume what's that going to do? It just means the substitution effect between minimum wage workers and very sticky wage workers really isn't going to show up because they're all going to be kind of in the same bundle, right? How does that change how you think about
So
that?
it is certainly true that there are other groups that have very sticky wages, and even some other groups that have sticky wages set by, for example, union contracts. That's another example of cases. And we have done analyses where we've sort of honed in on some of these other groups. So right now, in the regressions I'll be showing you today, we're focusing on minimum wage workers because that's a fairly well-defined, legislatively set sticky wage. But it's certainly true that there are these other groups, and we have done the parallel analysis focusing on same union workers. We find a very similar, slightly more noisy, but still statistically significant, similar result to what I'm going to show you today. Great. So in our baseline regression is going to be building on basically the Romer and Romer narrative approach style monetary policy regression. We have data from 1975, when the QCEW basically starts, or its digitized data starts, until 2008, which is when the zero lower bound is hit. And, a standard narrative approach monetary policy regression would look like this first equation I have up here, where you regress the change in employment, in our case, on lags of the change in employment and these terms, these sort of monetary policy shock terms, delta FFRs that I have here. We get the changes in employment from the QCEW, as I mentioned. That's the quarterly census of employment and wages. It has monthly data on employment. And the FFR, the federal funds rate shocks, we get those from Romer and Romer in our main specifications. We also use other shocks like bar shocks or the federal funds rate itself, but for our baseline specification, we use these Romer and Romer shocks. And, we're going to basically change that standard monetary policy regression fairly little for our first regression. So that all we're really doing is changing it to a state level regression rather than a national level regression. And we're interacting the minimum wage, the cost share of minimum wage workers in state S at time T with the federal funds rate shock. And all that I'm denoting with this, double hash notation is that we are also allowing the minimum wage share and the shocks themselves to enter independently. Not just the interaction effect.
So is LST the minimum wage workers in the state or all workers in the state?
So that's all workers, because the QCEW doesn't break it down into different workers, but we do have analysis later where we look at the CPS and we show that it's going primarily.
So at this point, I just want to make a little objection. That regression is commonly used to figure out the effect of monetary policy shocks, but that could be through a credit supply channel or God knows what else. You had a theory that said something about inflation, but we know that federal funds shocks have almost no detectable effect on inflation. Wouldn't we want to constrain it to go through inflation for that theory, or do you have in mind also some other more direct effects of federal funds rates on employment?
So we're going to try and present some evidence that, as you point out, there are other channels for monetary policy, some things that have to do with credit supply, the marginal propensity to consume, also important. What we're going to try and do is present some evidence that it's not going through that channel. So for example, we're going to present evidence that this isn't merely driven by correlations of the share of minimum wage workers with the marginal propensity to consume across places. We're going to put some banking variables directly into the regression should ideally help factor out considerations related to credit supply.
You check that it does go through the inflation channel?
So it's hard to run a regression at the state level with the relevant price outcomes because of the fact that the PPI data from the BLS, for example, is only available at the national level. There is, certain papers have tried to construct CPI measures annually at the state level. We have a little bit of data that we can work with on that, but it's it's only annually, not monthly. So we're not able to do as perfect an analysis of the price outcome as we can on employment. And we have some evidence on wages as well, which goes in the direction our model would suggest.
Ryan, can I jump in? I'm a bit confused by this regression as well. So you're showing here that there is an effect of monetary policy on employment period. That's what we have in this page. Is that fair?
That's the upper regression. That's the one that I'm saying Romer and Romer run, which we're modifying.
And what's the second? But the second regression isn't it in the same spirit? In fact, following up on John, I thought that the whole point of the exercises was to provide some evidence on rigidity, which is a big question. But then, even when you show up, when you showed us the first problem, I'm thinking about all these financial constraints type of literature where we know that the interest rate is affected by monetary policy. The cost of raising funds differs very much across firms. And how is that going to be factoring these regressions at all? I thought the argument was, look, we don't know if wages are rigid or not. I'm somehow going to show you that appropriately instrumenting the surprise effect of monetary policy shocks, I will tell you that in sectors where there's a greater share of minimum wage workers, wages tend not to change or change very little, and the extent to which they don't change is my measure of rigidity. And then I would start asking you all this question, but how about all the labor or input substitution patterns that you're not accounting for in this regression? Where is capital? Where are capital costs? Where are capital adjustment costs, so on and so forth? But this is very different from what I was expecting. So what I was expecting is coming up, or I'm not reading it here?
So, this regression is since the state by time level, we're leveraging variation in the minimum wage, the share of minimum wage workers across states and time. And what we're basically saying is how does the effect of monetary policy vary with the share of minimum wage workers across states and over time. Now, this is the very basic regression, so this one doesn't have a number of the other controls that I'm going to be running in other specifications. we are going to be try and shut down. You mentioned variations across industries, so we are going to try and account for whether there are sort of things going on in the background along the lines of the industries that have more minimum wage workers, or also the industries that for other reasons are just more impacted by monetary policy. So as we go through the talk, you'll see me try and control for more things, but the basic idea is that the minimum wage is a legislatively set, nominally rigid wage. So the idea is we're trying to hone in on something that we know is rigid, and then see how the efficacy of monetary policy varies with the extent to which that rigidity is in effect in a given state.
But efficacy measures what? What's efficacy here?
So here it's just, so for example, if there was a federal funds rate shock and the coefficient on the shock was 0, there was no effect of the shock on employment, then we would say it's not effective at all. If there's a larger effect of the federal funds rate change on employment, then monetary policy is more effective. Let's take a look at this baseline regression, and then, as I said, I'll get into some of the more detailed specifications with more controls. So what I'm plotting here is that the interaction coefficient sort of accumulated over 4 years, the interaction coefficient we saw in the previous slide. And in this baseline coefficient, this baseline specification, not only is it very strongly significant and quite large, if anything, it's almost too large. We'll see the magnitude goes down a bit in the specifications with more controls. But the interpretation, at least of this baseline regression, is that a state with a 3% cost share of minimum wage workers experiences at peak a 4.5 percentage point larger employment change in response to monetary policy than a 0% cost share state. Now, if you see the distribution of minimum wage cost shares across places in time, you can see that a 3% to 4% change is essentially the entire range, but that's still quite a large effect. So we're going to drill down on it by adding a lot of different controls and trying to provide evidence against other channels that this might be correlated with. Next slide, please. So first, I want to point out that we were using the Romer and Romer.
Can you just help us just a second with this numbers? So you said there's 10% of the workers are minimum wage workers. And just help me on that. How much inflation do I have to get to make this a sensible number?
So that's an interesting point. I suppose we could back out something like that. Yeah, that would be a useful exercise.
Could you go back to your previous, just so trying to digest that number? Oh, I'm sorry, you don't have the slides. Okay, don't. Okay,
there we go.
Let's screw things up. So a 3% cost share of minimum wage workers. Okay, that's a tiny amount of your workers are minimum wage.
Yeah, this is the cost share, which is of course lower than the actual share of workers, since minimum wage workers cost less, but
right.
Cost.
And then 4.5 percentage point larger employment change. Is that right?
Right.
So,
yeah.
Okay, so that's not. I was worried it was that's not percentage point of employed people. That's percentage point of the change, right? So if my unemployment rate went from 7 to 6. You're going to say 4.5% of that 1% is the difference. So a quite small number, which is actually good because that makes sense.
So it relates to the cost share of minimum wage workers in the state. You have to multiply the coefficient.
What does 4.5 percentage point mean? Larger employment.
So that's the employment change itself. So
in the state or among minimum wage workers?
This is overall. Like I said, later I'll show that this is disproportionately going through minimum wage workers, but in the overall QCW data, they don't break it down by minimum wage versus non-minimum wage workers. So I'm constrained to working with overall workers. But yes, this is quite a large effect, which is We think this one is almost too large, probably is too large, which is why we throw all of those different robustness checks at it. And we find that in most of them, and also in the model that we set up, which I didn't present here since today, since this is the full model, since this is a shorter talk, about 1/3 of that size is the magnitude we'd expect, and that is in fact.
Because that's the entire unemployment rate, basically.
Yeah.
It's
In response to it, and the typical shock is 25 basis points. So you're saying 25 basis points cures unemployment if you have a 3% cost share. That's
if you believe this regression, which is significantly larger than the ones that have more controls in it, then yes. And yeah, like a 3% cost share is sort of the whole range. But
I just wanted to say, I'm not criticizing it. Want to get a handle on the numbers. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Brian, just in terms of thinking about what variation is underlying the estimate that we're looking at right now, is this in large part being driven by the fact that, or by the time series variation in the minimum wage share, and telling us something about how employment evolved following monetary shocks in the 70s relative to more recent years?
So that's actually an excellent question. We're going to get later, I'll get to a section where we basically shut down all of the cross-sectional variation and focus on time series, and another regression where we shut down all the time series and focus on cross-sectional. And we're going to see that there's evidence of this pattern regardless of which variation we use. Now it is stronger for the time series variation, and it is indeed the case that we find this effect strongest in the first half of our data, back when the minimum wage share was a lot higher than it is today. But
are the shocks weighted by how large they are?
Yeah, so the Romer and
Paul Volcker cut the funds rate by 300 basis points in one fell swoop.
Right, so the Romer and Romer costs are geared toward they account for how large the individual.
Okay, so they're weighted by how large. Okay.
In some sense, the other stickinesses help you here, right? If a state that has higher minimum wages also has more unionized workers, also has more government workers, they tend to have lots of stickier wage regulations as well, and that would make the numbers make more sense. I presume you'll control for all that later, but in some sense, you could interpret it that way.
Yeah, that's a good point. And like I said, we've also done regressions where we use the union coverage share rather than the minimum wage worker share, and regressions where we throw them both in there, interact them both. And this minimum wage share does remain significant, but it goes down in terms of magnitudes in the way we'll see in these subsequent regressions.
Brian, can I follow up on a question about what's your intuition? So I was thinking at the undergraduate level, so monetary policy is expansionary. Interest rates go down, let's say prices go up. The real price of all inputs, let's say, could go up or down. The minimum wage workers' price go down, but then it's the relative price of inputs that matters for firms' decisions of who to employ and on what wage. So what is your prior for why what I'm seeing is really mediated by the minimum wage?
Well, so it's certainly
that's the part that I'm not so sure I follow. So it's a very interesting point, but you're already posing a question which is very interesting and very ambitious, because actually we don't know what's the transmission mechanism at the fine labor market level, because of the reason I gave you. Give me a firm who's deciding which inputs to buy, what's the scale of operation for the period, and the change in price, as we know, being non-uniform across inputs, changes how much I can spend on them and how much I'm willing to spend over one input versus the other. And that's already, it's a very interesting question, but somehow you want to hone in the point that the minimum wage channel is an additional channel, which to me is complicating the picture, not necessarily making it simpler. Does it make sense what I'm asking? You have to have a big story in mind already as to why would you expect a certain overall effect on labor.
So the point, I guess, that I'm trying to make is it's certainly true that the wage or the cost of other factors of production doesn't need to go up by exactly the same amount as the general price level. When you have inflation, there can be slight differences in the amount by which sort of each thing goes up. However, the minimum wage is still at whatever it previously was. And there was this disequilibrium that existed, which as a result of the expansionary monetary policy is being partially ameliorated. So more workers, which previously would have required a lower wage than the binding minimum wage to be hired. They couldn't be hired, now they can be hired. So it's certainly true that for the other inputs, there may be slight differences in the amount by which firms scale up their acquisition and use of those things. But the minimum wage has stayed at its previous level, and consequently, this has done something to minimum wage workers as an input that it hasn't done to the other inputs.
So your prior is a amount of magnitude. I'm thinking capital gets cheaper and gets a lot cheaper, relatively speaking. But you expect to see, therefore, the effect on minimum wage worker being more pronounced, even accounting for the effect I'm thinking of.
So, we, in our full model in the paper, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong on this one, Robbie, we look at how a number of different outcomes are affected. And, it is the case that my recollection is that it's the case that the largest effects are on minimum wage labor, precisely because of this reason. That it's certainly the case that, that scale effect exists, that, other things also become cheaper. You want to buy more of these other things because one of your inputs has become cheaper. But the specific input that has become cheaper by the greatest extent because of the fact that it was in disequilibrium before, because of the fact there's this price floor, is minimum wage labor. And so that substitution effect does end up being larger than the scale effect. And that's the idea.
Can I make a couple comments here? First, there's a huge literature that tries to estimate directly the effect of minimum wage changes on employment of low-skilled labor, typically using much larger variation than what you've got here. And that literature for decades has been arguing over the effects. And I think if you took the point estimates from that literature, even anything in the range of the point, this is a version of John Cochrane's earlier remark. Take the point estimates of the estimated elasticities of employment or low-skill employment in response to minimum wage effect. I don't think you're going to get anything you could detect with this empirical strategy. So that's one comment. You could go that route and just say what would I need in the way of an inflation change to even get something that I could estimate. The second comment I want to make is, many of the proponents of minimum wage legislation argue that it's ameliorating monopsony wage setting. And there over, at least in a certain range, the employment effect goes in the other direction. If the minimum wage becomes less binding, then that gives employers more scope to exercise their monopsony power, and you get less employment, not more, because you're moving along the labor supply curve rather than the labor demand curve. So I mean, you have a competitive model in the back of your mind, which that kind of fits my priors, but there are a lot of people who argue otherwise in this literature.
So yeah, you're right. It's a literature that has had a lot of back and forth over the years, and there are basically two schools of thought. The first being that there's very little effect overall of minimum wage changes on employment. The other being that there are larger effects. And now again, I didn't show the full model. I guess if you back out the sort of implied elasticities and compare that to these two strands of the literature, we're about in line with the Clemens and Wither, the Newmark estimates. So what we find is sort of in line with this side of the literature that suggests that there are negative effects on employment of increasing amount.
I don't see how you get to that conclusion without making some assumption about how the monetary policy shocks you got in your regression translate into movements in inflation. I didn't hear any of that.
Well, Part of that, I think, is because of the fact that we suppressed the discussion of the model today, because it's a shorter presentation and we wanted to focus a bit more on the empirics also, since we thought that was more appropriate for this setting. We do have a full model where we discuss this sort of the transmission mechanism in a bit more detail. But you're right that it does require this implies elasticities that are in line with the side of the minimum wage literature that suggests larger effects of minimum wages on employment. And I would also point out, though, that when we're talking about, the early 1980s, late 1970s, an era when in a lot of states you have 15%, 20% of workers on the minimum wage, and when you're talking about a shock like the Volcker shock, I think that does equate to a pretty large change in the minimum wage, essentially. And so I do think that it's not necessarily a tiny change that you wouldn't expect to pick anything up from. So a couple of these first robustness checks I want to talk about. So if we use VAR shocks instead of the narrative Romer and Romer shocks, we get a similar result. The magnitude is reduced by about a half, so we're getting down to somewhat smaller levels there. We can also run the same exercise as in our main specification on Canadian data, so just leverage the differences across provinces in time in the minimum wage share, and use Canadian shock series monetary policy. Find a very similar outcome there. Next slide, please. So another thing you might worry about is whether it's the case that states with a higher share of minimum wage workers have different industries than other states. And these are the industries that are also exposed or more exposed to monetary policy. So I can say a few things to that. Firstly, as I'll show you, the result is robust to the addition of state fixed effects and time fixed effects. So that would control for persistent industry differences by state and also for national level time trends. It's also robust to adding a Bartik control variable, which we can construct by, in each time period, computing the national level employment growth in each industry. And then for each state and time period, weighting the national industry employment growth by the share in that state, in that industry in the last period. Construct this shift share instrument, which is designed to sort of factor out these industry specific time trends. And next slide, please.
Do you have a story or thought on why different states have different minimum wages? That clearly matters. I mean, we can't just treat it as random.
When we're talking about the federal minimum wage, which was the binding minimum wage for the first, for the most of the 1970s and 1980s, most states didn't have a state minimum wage that was above the federal minimum wage. It was, of course, federally set and was to some extent forced on various states. Today, it varies a bit more. So a lot of states will set their own minimum wage, and then other states, the other half of states essentially.
And I'm sorry, the main thing is, of course, I got this wrong. Your variable is the fraction of workers at minimum wage, which is, if I want to talk about what's endogenous, I should be talking about that, not the minimum wage itself.
Right. And, some of the things we're trying to do with these controls are factor out some potential industry endogeneities that, may correlate.
So, then you have to, we did the theory that we talked about was partial equilibrium, but then you have to why are those industries affected by monetary policy? You have to ask it sort of in a general equilibrium way.
So that's true. What we're trying to do here is factor out the fact that some of those industries may be concentrated. The industries that are more affected may be concentrated in certain states. So it's true, if we were interested in answering the question of why those industries are more affected by monetary policy, that would be sort of a different question. We could look into that, but the idea here is more to factor that out and sort of hone in on this variation. Another thing that I'm not showing that we also did is you can in fact isolate that variation that's coming from the policy changes, which is presumably also less correlated with specific industries. So the state increases its minimum wage, or the federal government increases its minimum wage. We can run an IV specification where we instrument for the share of minimum wage workers with those state minimum wage changes, and we find bigger magnitude, but same significant result there, as I'll show you for these. So basically, whichever source of variation we hone in.
Suppose a stage has stickier prices than another state, and that's why those industries get affected. That certainly would seem to contaminate the minimum wage regression, at least.
I see. Yeah, that's an interesting point. So we go ahead.
No, Brian, please.
Yeah, so we have, as you'll see in another couple of slides, we have some other methods where we try and deal with state confounds rather than industry confounds, but thinking about the price stickiness by state specifically is an interesting point. We can think about whether we can specifically control for that.
Well, it's about what are the other reasons monetary policy affects things.
Right.
That's just one of them. Okay.
So a quick question here. I was thinking that, so let's say the approach here is like in the trade literature, that we want to know how trade shocks affect employment of, say, minimum wage worker, and you want to, let's say, control for the degree of exposure, trade exposure of a state, the sector. But here the exposure in the minimum wage is in a way endogenous, because it depends on how much such workers you have. It's not like trade exposure that is in the trade literature affected by how open a certain market is to imports. But here I was thinking, so that's the straw man in your case. But then you could do, since you have a model, and actually you have a very interesting model, you could refine this trade-like type of regression with the control function approach, where the control function comes, let's say, as an approximation to the first order conditions in your own model. So you could really account for all we are asking, like, are there other input moving at the same time? Are all this decision endogenous? And the proper control function derived from your model could go a long way at addressing all of these questions. Does that make sense, Ryan?
Yeah, that's an excellent suggestion. Yeah, that's basically using the model to add more structure to the the key object we're using on our right.
Because it could guide a lot more than an IV, where maybe you're not on the strongest ground arguing what's exogenous to what, especially state level minimum wages. But you have a beautiful, actually very elegant model, if for those who haven't had the time or chance to see it. And that's a perfect template for such an exercise. In fact, I thought you were going there, showing us, you see, this is the naive prima facie view, but I can go much deeper, and I think you can through the model.
Yeah, that's an excellent suggestion. Basically what we're doing right now in the empirical section is we start out with, the still fairly highly endogenous share minimum wage variable. And like I said, we've got these we're drilling down on different sources of variation in that variable and showing that we get the same result regardless of which one we drill down on. But I think that another thing we can add to that analysis, would be to do as you say and use the model to get more structure on that variable. I think that's an excellent suggestion. We'll do that. Right. So what I'm showing here is just the two specifications that I described on the previous slide. So on the left panel here, basically the baseline specification with state fixed effects and time fixed effects added. The magnitude is down by 1 to 1/3 of what it was in the initial regression. So a lot more in line with the full model that we have, but still quite significant statistically. And same on the right panel, where in addition to the state and time fixed effects, we throw in that employment shift share that we constructed, similar magnitude, and significant as well. So other things that we can add to that specification are crude measures of banking use, deposits per capita, the share of liquid deposits in banks, or personal income per capita, which potentially correlated with the marginal propensity to consume. Turns out if we either just throw these in as controls, or if we interact them with the shock series, it doesn't kill or even really reduce the significance of our main result of the interaction coefficient.
Could I ask to what extent this is, which this isn't a criticism, but most things that I've seen like this really depend on 1980 to 1984, because that's when all the action on monetary policy shocks and all the action on inflation happened. That's not necessarily criticism. That is the most significant historical episode. And if we just don't have any inflation or monetary policy shocks after that, well, so what? But it is interesting to know is, are we summarizing really, here's what happened in 1980 to 1984, or is there, does it still show up, do those standard error bars not just get swallowed into zero when you're outside that time period?
No, that's an excellent question. We'll get to that in more detail in some of the later slides, but
Sorry.
Essentially, okay. Yeah, I'll talk about that a little later. So another thing we can do is, instead of using the Romer and Romer shocks or VAR shocks, suppose we just throw the raw federal fund rate shocks in there themselves. We get a very similar relationship, regardless of whether we just do the simple baseline specification with federal funds rate shocks, or if we throw in all of those control variables, like I do in the right-hand side panel here. Again, reduces the magnitude a bit, but remains strongly significant in all cases. So, you might wonder if the states with a high share of minimum wage workers are the same states over time. A few responses to that. So firstly, the states with a high share of minimum wage workers are in fact changing over our sample. So in the earlier era, it is the southern states that tend to be significantly poorer. And yet the federal minimum wage was similar. It was basically the same. The minimum wage was basically the same due to the federal minimum wage in the early era of our results. And, we showed also that the baseline results are robust to state fixed effects and time fixed effects. So those things didn't kill it. And also, if instead of the minimum wage share, we interact with a dummy for being in the South, that doesn't really drive the result. It really is about the minimum wage share. But another thing we can do is we can basically perform county level analysis and include state by time fixed effects in there. So, literally just doing a within state analysis where we leverage the fact that different counties have different minimum wage shares. And, there's a bit more measurement error in this specification, because to get county level minimum wage shares, we have to use the every 10 years census data. So it's not the perfect specification, but and it's just borderline significant, but we do find a similar magnitude and a similar pattern, even if we hone in and focus on that cross-sectional variation. Conversely, we can do the opposite. We can shut down the cross-sectional variation and focus entirely on the time series variation by interacting the shock series with state fixed effects. So that's what I do by the addition of this last term in this specification. Interact state fixed effects with the shock series to see whether there's just a persistent difference by state in the effectiveness of the shocks. Once again, a very similar pattern. Standard error bars get a bit bigger, but we find the same pattern that remains significant in most of the data. So, one thing that we can do is get a bit more precisely at the mechanism and see whether this is in fact driven by minimum wage workers, as we would expect it is. So, as I've mentioned a few times, the QCEW data, of course, doesn't break down workers by whether they're minimum wage or non-minimum wage workers. But in the CPS, in the current population survey, in the outgoing rotation groups that are asked in the 4th month and in the final month that individuals are present in the CPS, they're asked a variety of questions about their employment and wage status, including their hourly wage. We can leverage this data to determine whether indeed expansionary monetary policy is leading to new hires that are disproportionately minimum wage workers. So is it the case that minimum wage workers are the ones that are disproportionately being hired as a result of these shocks? And we do get a somewhat different time pattern whether we use the FFR, federal funds rate shocks, as we do in the left panel here, or the Romer and Romer shocks on the right panel. But it does indeed seem to be the case that expansionary monetary policy leads to new hires being disproportionately minimum wage workers. Contractionary monetary policy leads to decreases in the share of new hires that are minimum wage workers. I only have this for hires up here. We find a similar result, though admittedly a bit less strong on the fires.
Can I ask you? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead and go ahead, Elena.
Thank you. So what identification scheme you use? You know the literature and the debates. Are you not doing local projection because you have controls? Can you talk about what your guys' feeling and about the data and the methods are?
Yeah, so
did you think about sign restriction, or you want to point identified effects? I'm curious about your thinking on this.
Yeah, so those are good suggestions. In the empirical section, I guess we've been going with a fairly reduced form approach. Just adding some fixed effects essentially, and this is more. This has a flavor of a difference in differences specification in some ways, but we could certainly add more structure again, informed by the model or.
Now, think about something else, Ryan. Going back to John's question, that there are puzzles when you go past the 80s. That you have, if you run standard VARs from Ramey's handbook chapter, you get the wrong effect. You get an expansionary policy, it's a contractionary effect on output. And so there's gigantic literature on fixes, how to fix that. And I mean, we know that local projection methods tend to have less of an issue in this dimension. There are different identification methods. Ramey likes very much suggest the narrative approach that Ramey with Cristiano type of identification restrictions. What John was saying is that, of course, we know that that's a very big issue for the entire literature, but we know some methods work better than others. Better meaning predicting the sign, the right sign to start with.
Yeah, so that's thanks for bringing that up. I guess we're only partially aware of that literature. So spoiler alert for the couple of slides from now is we are going to find that these effects that we are picking up are driven by the earlier period, the earlier half of our panel, like 1975 to 1990, which is, as you say, consistent with the fact that if you just run a basic Romer and Romer specification over the latter period, or some of these other styles of specifications, you don't find anything. But that's an interesting point that, there are fixes that do get you to find something in the later period. So perhaps we could apply some of those and see if we then find bite for the later period as well.
Just to follow up on, can I follow up on the question with Valerie Ramey's paper? Why not use method of external instruments? It's become pretty standard to understand that these Romer and Romer shocks are not structural, and either external instruments or external instruments with local projections seem like what you'd want to do with this data in this in that part of this context, not everything.
Yeah, so I think that's a good suggestion. We can definitely apply that. I mean, we don't have a strong, we're not married to one type of shocks or one type of identification strategy or the other. Like as you see, we're sort of trying to come at it from a bunch of different angles. So certainly suggestions of other angles like that are appreciated.
Could I, the usual story we tell for monetary policy is not that it changes the cost of hiring workers, but that it changes demand for the firm's output. So, higher interest rates for one or another mechanism changes demand for output, and the companies are shut. They have less demand for output, so they have less demand for labor. And we kind of know that recessions hit on low income and low skilled people more. So you'd kind of say naturally, yeah, now you'd also say that durable goods manufacturing gets hit more. That I think is typically not so much, but I don't know, it depends which industries. I know you control for industries, but really the usual story is through the demand for the firm's output and a shift in the demand for labor, which then has impacts on different kinds of labor rather than everything else is fine, but we just shifted the cost of labor by shifting inflation.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, like you say, we do try and control for those factors, but I agree that, our story is somewhat different from the usual story. Maybe to some extent, something I'll show you on the next slide or two relates to that. So maybe
This may be a positive suggestion. We've been a little critical about where's the inflation. I mean, you could use national inflation. This is usually, except for there isn't usually much change in inflation, but perhaps we could just interpret it as, hey, what you're seeing is how monetary policy shocks hurt minimum wage employment more through the demand channel, having nothing to do with inflation.
yeah, that's an interesting point.
I thought your answer is that yes, I'm potentially already accounting for that, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true that if we're correctly controlling for these sort of industry factors, then we should be accounting for that. But it could also be nice if we're able to hone in on that more specifically to get a sense of how
Even
important.
within an industry, demand goes down, who do you fire first?
Yeah,
You hire the low skilled, even if everybody industry is the same. There's a lot of work, I don't really follow this, but on who gets hurt more by recessions and monetary policy. The Fed's big into that stuff now.
yeah. So, just wanted to point out, it's also the case that we have data on establishments and establishment formation in the QCW. And so we can see whether indeed we're getting reduced business formation in response to these contractionary shocks that's more serious in places with higher minimum wage shares. And, indeed that's the case. So we have baseline specification in the left panel here and throw in the state and time fixed effects and the shift share. We get, it's a bit more borderline, but we again get that. And so our full model in our paper does suggest a larger effect for tradables. If our empirical results are actually driven by differences in the MPC across places, the general story is that we would expect the opposite result, that the effect on going through non-tradables would be larger, since non-tradables must be produced locally. But in fact, we do find these larger effects on tradables. That's consistent with what our model suggests. Some implications in terms of the overall effect. This is sort of what I was hinting at earlier. I'd get to later in terms of whether this is driven by the earlier or later period. So what I have in this graph here is just the standard Romer and Romer regression. So no interaction with our minimum wage share. So this is already known that, the effects are driven by the 70s and 80s rather than by the later period, the 1990s and 2000s. We see that the employment effect is only statistically significantly there in the first half of that panel. And in that period, the peak effect of a 1 percentage point monetary policy shock is a 2.8 percentage point reduction in employment. The majority of our empirical specifications you just saw have had a peak interaction effect of approximately -0.5. Since the average minimum wage cost share over this earlier period is 2.28%, this implies that over this earlier period, the minimum wage channel of monetary policy is responsible for about 2/5 of monetary policy's total effect, slightly smaller in some specifications, slightly larger in others, but that's what our little back of the envelope calculation would suggest. Great. So in conclusion, we argue that minimum wages, since they represent a legislatively sticky wage in the economy, they're a good context for studying the rigid wage channel of monetary policy. Our model, which I didn't go into in detail today, in the interest of time, and our empirical results show that the highest minimum wage share states could experience almost 4 percentage point more employment growth than states without minimum wage workers in response to expansionary monetary policy shock. And this result, reveals substantial heterogeneity in the employment effects of monetary policy across states and time, which also hasn't necessarily been documented in detail before. And we argue that this channel may account for really a non-trivial share of the effect of monetary policy on employment back in the era of the 70s and 80s, when there were a fairly high share of workers on the minimum wage. And we also relate this potentially to part of the reason why the effect of monetary policy has been found to be falling over time. thank you very much for all your questions and for your attention, and now open for Q&A.
Thank you, very interesting.
So Brian, the impact of the monetary policy diminishing, what research are we referring to there? I'm not familiar with that. Is the impacts are diminishing?
Yeah, so this is sort of what was summarized in that second to last slide, where I showed that if you just run the basic Romer and Romer narrative approach regression over the earlier half and the later half of the panel, you find much smaller or even zero effects over the latter period. And this isn't something newly that we've discovered. Other papers have commented on this, and so we're just saying that potentially part of the reason for this could relate to the fact that this one channel of monetary policy that we're identifying has been more down over time.
It's just the case always that monetary policy shocks contribute tiny fractions of the variance of anything. It's almost all other shocks that account for employment, output, inflation, and so forth.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, it's certainly the case that monetary policy shocks have gotten smaller in magnitude compared to, the Volcker era. There's massive shocks.
There have also been a lot of fiscal shocks that are sometimes joint, more or less temporally joint with monetary policy shocks.
That's true.
And some of them, including obviously the recent ones, are focused heavily on transfers to low-income people, including the people that would be minimum wage workers. And that is, it seems to me, a fertile avenue for you to explore.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there are implications for how we should see fiscal policy shocks even vary in their magnitude with variation in the minimum wage share across states. And we did a little bit of work on that in the past, and it found that it was generally consistent with what our intuition was, but we should develop that a bit more, or at least maybe add it as a control in certain specifications.
Good.
So is it?
Let me ask this 41%, 2/5 of the impact is due to the minimum wage. How do you compare that? If there was no, if there's no minimum wage, it'd be no impact, or 60%? What is the?
No, so I guess what that's saying is that in the Volcker era, essentially, when you had this very high minimum wage share, and when our overall regression show there was an effect of monetary policy, our magnitudes imply that something around 2/5 of the total effect of monetary policy in that era had to do with this channel of monetary policy. So if you totally shut it down, there would still, it would still be effective. It would be 60% as effective, is what that's telling us.
Steve has a question. Steve?
Just a small suggestion. The federal minimum wage applies to Puerto Rico, and there's a much higher share of the workforce affected by the federal minimum wage in Puerto Rico than any U.S. state. So if your view is right, then monetary policy effects on Puerto Rico ought to be disproportionate, much larger than any other state, any state, I should say, since Puerto Rico's not a state. And I realize Puerto Rico's unusual in multiple respects, but there is I think it's at least twice as high as any U.S. state, if I remember right. The share of the workforce that's directly affected by the federal minimum wage.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. I think the recent share for Puerto Rico is comparable or even very slightly higher than the share that certain states of the South had back in the 1970s. So it could be a useful case study to do. That's a good suggestion.
Any other questions, Elena?
Yeah, a quick question about magnitude, Ryan. You too, actually, you and Robbie know about the debate on the degree of rigidity of wages. Are you trying, is there a sense that you can get a measure? I thought that at least somehow is a theme in the paper that you're trying to get to the question how rigid really wages are, and can we tease them out from this analysis of the impact of monetary shocks? Are you trying to get a back of the envelope of that kind, or really the question is, let me see how monetary policy affect labor markets for segments of participants that we know are likely to be
Yes.
disproportionately affected?
So I guess our, one thing that sort of is what you're saying is, can we get a, some estimate of how important wage rigidity is? And that's been a big debate. We do cite a number of these papers in our paper. Our view of what we were doing was more along the lines of, okay, there may be certain areas in the economy that are more or less rigid, but here's one area that we know is rigid by definition, by the fact that it's a legislatively set nominal rigidity. So let's focus in on this area that we know is rigid and see how much this rigidity that we know exists matters. So it's more about focusing in on something that we know is rigid than making a broader estimate of what rigidity is in the broader economy. At least that's what we saw our goal as. We certainly do recognize that there is this large literature debating how rigid wages actually are, and different papers which take different approaches come up with somewhat different estimates. We were sort of aiming to skirt that a bit and focus on this thing that it's easy to agree is rigid, because the definition of what a minimum wage is legislatively set out.
But then aren't your results, the two of you's results, that effectively if the real price is the one that matters, and if the allocative price of labor is the hourly price of it, which is debated, in most models it isn't, it's not the relevant price. But if that's the relevant price, your conclusion is that they're not that rigid after all. I mean, you showed us gigantic magnitudes.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Right? If there was, this level of rigidity, or a moderate level of rigidity throughout the economy, I guess you would expect then even larger effects of monetary policy. Yeah, so that's an interesting way of looking at it.
So, Robbie, do you have any comments you want to make, Robbie?
I don't think so. I thought Brian did a great job.
Okay, me too. Okay. Any other comments or thoughts? Okay.
Well, keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, Brian. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, Brian. That was great.